Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that might shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome. Picture this, the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, builders of aqueducts and colosseums, masters of engineering and law. Now imagine walking through their streets and being hit by a wave of human urine mixed with rotting fish guts. Confused? You should be. Because Rome consumed 2,800 tons of frankincense and 550 tons of myrrh every single year, more perfume than any civilization in history, yet their city reeked in ways that would make a modern sewage plant smell like a flower garden. How could the people who invented luxury bathing culture also use stale urine to wash their finest togas? Tonight, we are diving into the most fascinating paradox of the ancient world. So before we step into the fragrant chaos of ancient Rome together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely find value in what we explore tonight. And I am curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you in bed on a late night drive, or perhaps winding down after a long day? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I truly love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us embark on this evening's journey into the scented shadows of Rome. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are standing in the Forum Romanum on a sweltering summer afternoon in the year 120 Anno Domini. The sun beats down on white marble columns that gleam so brightly they hurt your eyes. You can hear the thunderous roar of a crowd from the nearby Colosseum, the shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere in the distance. Visually, it is magnificent. Sonically, it is alive with energy. But then the wind shifts, and suddenly your nose tells you a completely different story. The first thing that hits you is not what you would expect. It is not the pleasant aroma of baking bread or roasting meat, though those scents are certainly there, weaving through the air. No, the first assault on your senses is something far more complex, far more unsettling. It is a thick, humid mixture of human sweat and olive oil, yes, but underneath that lies something sharper, more acrid. It is the unmistakable tang of stale urine, wafting from the Forlonica, the laundry just down the street. And beneath that, if the wind is just right, you catch the sickly sweet smell of rotting fish intestines from the Garam factory on the outskirts of town, miles away, but somehow still detectable when the breeze cooperates. This is the paradox we are here to untangle tonight. How did a civilization so obsessed with cleanliness, so devoted to the ritual of bathing that they built structures we still marvel at today, end up creating cities that smelled like a combination of a fish market, a tannery, and a public restroom all rolled into one? Let us start with what the Romans got right, because they truly were revolutionary in many ways. The thermae, the great public baths, were architectural marvels. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. Think about that for a moment. 1,600 people all pursuing cleanliness simultaneously in a building that featured heated floors, cold plunge pools, warm soaking tubs, exercise areas, libraries, and even art galleries. The Romans did not just bathe. They made bathing into a social institution, a cornerstone of civilized life. Wealthy Romans would spend hours at the baths every single day. Not just washing, mind you, but socializing, conducting business, getting massages with perfumed oils in special rooms called unctoria. They would oil their bodies with expensive scented olive oil, imported from across the empire, then scrape it off with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, believing this method removed dirt and impurities far more effectively than anything else available. And the perfumes. Oh, the perfumes. Rome was absolutely drunk on fragrance. Entire streets in the city were lined with nothing but perfume shops, each one competing to offer the most exotic scents from the farthest reaches of the empire. You could buy powders made from crushed flower petals, liquids made from oils squeezed from roses and jasmine, extracts of cinnamon from India, frankincense from Arabia, saffron from Persia. The variety was staggering. The wealthy applied different scents to different parts of their bodies. This was not simply splashing on some cologne and calling it a day. No, a Roman aristocrat might have mint on her arms, marjoram on her hair, palm oil on her chest, an extract of ground ivy on her neck and knees. Soldiers even perfumed themselves before battle, choosing masculine scents like cedar, pine and mimosa. Can you imagine? Warriors heading into combat, swords drawn, shields raised, smelling like a forest after rain. Julius Caesar himself was famous for his signature scent. Historical accounts tell us he favoured a perfume called telinum, a greasy ointment made from fenugreek, marjoram, and yellow sweet clover. Whenever Caesar entered a room, people knew it was him before they even saw him, simply from that distinctive fragrance preceding him, like an aromatic announcement of power. The Romans even perfumed things we would never think to perfume today. They scented their furniture. They scented their clothes. They scented the soles of their feet. Yes, the bottoms of their feet, the part that touches the ground. Wealthy families would even perfume their household pets. Imagine a dog that smells like jasmine, or a donkey anointed with rose oil, clip-clopping through the streets. It sounds absurd to us, but to a Roman it made perfect sense. Everything and everyone should smell pleasant. That was civilization. And yet here is where things get strange. Here is where the paradox deepens. Because for all this obsession with pleasant aromas, for all these baths and oils and perfumes, the Romans had some habits that would make us recoil in horror today. They did not use soap for personal hygiene. Soap existed, they knew about it, but it was considered more of a hair product, not something you would use on your body. Instead, they relied exclusively on that olive oil and strigil method I mentioned earlier. Now here is the problem with that approach. Olive oil does not mix with water. You know this if you have ever tried to make a salad dressing. Oil and water separate. They repel each other. So when a Roman would coat themselves in oil, add in their dead skin cells and sweat and dirt, then scrape it all off with a bronze tool, what do you think happened to that disgusting mixture? It certainly did not just vanish into thin air. In the public baths, workers would scrape this oil-skin-dirt combination off people all day long, and sometimes, according to ancient sources, they would literally fling it at the walls, just splatter it there. The baths had drains, yes, but remember, oil floats on water. It does not drain away cleanly. So these magnificent marble pools, these architectural wonders, were actually covered in a thin film of greasy, grimy, skin cell-laden oil. And people would sit in these tubs, 8 to 12 bathers at a time in the smaller pools, soaking in this shared soup of humanity. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, is it not? They believed they were practicing the highest form of hygiene, the pinnacle of cleanliness, while actually creating conditions that would horrify any modern health inspector. But wait, it gets even more interesting. Because while the wealthy were soaking in their oil-slicked baths and coating themselves in imported perfumes, there was an entire industry thriving in the city that depended on something far less glamorous. Something that, quite frankly, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you about, except that it is historically accurate and utterly fascinating. The fullers, the laundry workers of Rome, these were the people responsible for keeping all those brilliant white togas clean, for processing new fabric, for maintaining the appearance of respectability that Roman society demanded. And their secret weapon, their primary cleaning agent, was human urine. I want you to really think about this for a moment. While senators were debating laws in the Forum, while poets were composing odes to beauty and virtue, while philosophers were discussing the nature of the good life, there were workers standing knee-deep in vats of stale human urine, stomping on togas like they were crushing grapes for wine. The fullers would place large jars on street corners throughout the city, and passers-by were actively encouraged to relieve themselves into these vessels. When the jars filled up, workers would collect them and bring them back to the fullonica, the laundry workshop. There they would pour the urine into large vats, mix it with water and something called fuller's earth, a type of clay, then throw in the dirty clothes and literally jump in after them, treading the fabric with their bare feet for hours. Why urine? Well, the Romans understood something about chemistry that we have only recently rediscovered in our modern age. When urine sits and ferments, especially in a warm climate like Italy's, it breaks down into ammonia. And ammonia is an extraordinarily effective cleaning agent. It cuts through grease, it removes stains, it whitens fabric. The Romans did not understand the chemistry in our modern scientific terms, but they understood the results. It worked. It worked incredibly well. But it also meant that these Philoniae reeked. The smell of stale, fermenting urine is pungent beyond description. It is sharp, it is acrid, it burns your nostrils and lingers in your throat. And these workshops operated all day, every day, with dozens of workers treading urine-soaked fabric, with vats of the stuff sitting out in the open, fermenting in the Italian sun. The Roman poet Martial wrote about this, and his words drip with sarcasm. He mocked a man who always seemed to have a supply of urine ready, joking that the man must be incredibly well hydrated. The smell was so notorious, so associated with the fuller's trade, it became a source of social stigma. Fullers were essential workers. Rome could not function without them, but they were also looked down upon, the butt of jokes, people you did not want to stand too close to at the market. And here is perhaps the wildest part of this whole story. The Emperor Vespasian, ruling in the 1st century, saw an opportunity in all this urine collection. He imposed a tax on it. Yes, a urine tax. The fullers had to pay the government for the privilege of collecting urine from public urinals. When Vespasian's son complained that this was undignified, that taxing urine was beneath the dignity of Rome, Vespasian supposedly held up a gold coin to his son's nose and asked, "Does it smell?" His son admitted it did not, and Vespasian replied with words that have echoed through history, "Pecunia non olet." Money does not stink. That phrase became famous. It is still used today in business and economics, but what it really represents is this bizarre Roman ability to compartmentalize, to hold two completely contradictory ideas in their head simultaneously. Yes, urine is disgusting. Yes, we want our cities to smell like roses and frankincense. But also, yes, urine is useful, and useful things have value, and valuable things can be taxed, and we will not let our noses override our practical economic sense. So picture this scene now, in your mind. You're back in that forum, standing under that blazing sun. To your left, there is a perfume shop where a wealthy matron is sampling a new scent from Egypt, something exotic and expensive made from lotus flowers and myrrh. She dabs it on her wrists, behind her ears, even on the soles of her feet, as is proper. She smells divine, like a walking garden. But 10 feet away, a fuller is emptying one of those street corner urine collection jars, and some of it sloshes over the side, splashing onto the pavement where it will sit, baking in the heat, until the next rain shower washes it away. The two scents, expensive perfume and cheap urine, mingle in the air, creating an olfactory experience that is uniquely, bizarrely Roman. This is the world we are exploring together tonight. A world where luxury and filth existed side by side, not in opposition, but in strange harmony. A world where the same people who would spend a fortune on imported fragrances also thought nothing of walking past human waste on their way to the baths. A world that challenges our modern assumptions about what cleanliness means, about what civilization requires, about the relationship between how things look and how things smell. The Romans built aqueducts that carried fresh water from mountains dozens of miles away. They built sewers. The famous Cloaca Maxima is still functioning today, more than 2,000 years later. They built temples that touched the sky and roads that connected an empire. But they also lived in a city where the smell of human waste was simply part of the background noise of daily life. No more remarkable than the sound of cartwheels on cobblestones or the cry of seagulls over the Tiber River. And that is what makes this story so compelling, so worth our time tonight. Because it reveals something profound about human nature, about how cultures define normalcy, about how quickly we adapt to our circumstances and then defend them as not just acceptable but ideal. The Romans did not complain much about how their city smelled. We have thousands of documents, letters, poems, and historical accounts from ancient Rome, and very few of them mention the odour of the streets as a problem. Why? Because to them, this was simply what cities smelled like. This was the scent of civilization, of commerce, of life happening at a grand scale. The historian Neville Morley has suggested that to the Romans, these smells were not unpleasant at all. They were the smells of home. They were familiar, comforting even. They meant safety, community, the hustle and bustle of urban life. Just as we have grown accustomed to the smell of car exhaust and fast food and industrial cleaning products, scents that would probably horrify our ancestors from 200 years ago, the Romans had their own olfactory landscape that felt normal to them, even when it included elements we would find absolutely revolting. But we are just getting started on this aromatic journey through ancient Rome. We've explored the paradox, established the contrast between what the Romans believed about cleanliness and what was actually happening in their streets and baths. We have met the fullers knee-deep in their urine vats. We have caught a whiff of Caesar's signature perfume. But there is so much more to this story, because we have not yet talked about why the Romans needed quite so much perfume in the first place. We have not explored the actual biology and chemistry of body odour in a hot Mediterranean climate when people are using oil instead of soap. We have not discussed the truly bizarre methods the Romans used to try to control their body odour. Methods that involve drinking strange concoctions and chewing unusual plants, all in a desperate attempt to not smell like, well, like humans who did not have access to modern deodorant. That is where we are heading next. Into the sweat glands and skin folds of ancient Rome, into the science of stink and the desperate, sometimes hilarious attempts to mask it. Because if you think using urine to wash clothes is strange, just wait until you hear about what they thought would stop their armpits from smelling. So stay with me. Keep those eyes closed if you like. Keep breathing deeply, letting your mind wander through these marble streets. Because we are about to get even more intimate with our Roman ancestors, to understand them not as distant figures in togas, but as real people, sweating and smelling and trying their best to seem civilized in a world that offered them very different tools than we have today. Now, let us talk about something we do not often discuss when we think about ancient civilizations. Let us talk about sweat. I know, not exactly the most glamorous topic, but stay with me, because understanding why Romans sweated the way they did, and more importantly, why that sweat smelled the way it did, is absolutely crucial to understanding their entire relationship with perfume and cleanliness. And trust me, the science behind this is far more fascinating than you might expect. Have you ever wondered why body odour even exists? I mean really stop to think about it. Sweat itself, pure sweat fresh from your pores, does not actually smell like anything. It is mostly just water and salt. If you could catch sweat the moment it leaves your body and smell it, you would detect almost nothing. So where does that characteristic smell come from? The one we spend billions of dollars every year trying to mask with deodorants and antiperspirants? The answer is bacteria. Specifically, bacteria living on your skin that feed on the proteins and fatty acids in your sweat. These microscopic organisms break down those compounds, and their waste products, their literal excrement, create the odors we associate with body odor. Essentially, when you smell someone's armpit, you are smelling bacterial poop. Pleasant thought, right? But understanding this helps us understand just how different the Roman experience was from ours. See, we have two different types of sweat glands. Eccrine glands, which cover most of your body, produce that watery, salty sweat that helps you cool down. Then you have apocrine glands, concentrated in your armpits, groin, and around your nipples. These glands produce a thicker, milkier sweat that is rich in proteins and fatty acids, basically a bacterial buffet. And in the hot, humid climate of the Mediterranean, in a city like Rome where summer temperatures regularly climbed above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, people were sweating constantly, profusely, from both types of glands all day long. But here is where things get really interesting. Remember how I told you the Romans used olive oil instead of soap? Well, that decision had consequences they probably never fully understood. When you wash with soap, you are removing not just dirt and dead skin cells, but also the bacteria living on your skin. Modern antibacterial soaps are particularly effective at this, but even regular soap disrupts bacterial colonies significantly. So when you step out of a modern shower, you have temporarily reduced the bacterial population on your skin. It will grow back, it always does, but you get a window of time where there is simply less bacteria there to create odour. The Romans were doing the exact opposite. They were coating their skin in oil. And what does oil do? It creates the perfect environment for bacteria to thrive. It traps moisture against the skin. It provides additional nutrients. It's like setting out a welcome mat for every microorganism that wants to set up shop in your armpit. Then they would scrape off the oil, yes, but they were not actually killing or removing the bacterial colonies in any meaningful way. If anything, they were probably spreading bacteria around or redistributing it across different parts of their body with that strigil. So picture a Roman man or woman in the summer heat. They've applied olive oil to their skin, maybe scented olive oil if they can afford it, but still fundamentally oil. They're sweating through the oil. Bacteria are having an absolute feast. And unlike us, they do not have cotton or synthetic fabrics that wick moisture away. They're wearing wool, thick, heavy wool togas and tunics that trap heat and moisture against the body. Wool is an amazing fabric in many ways. It is warm in winter, it is durable, it can be dyed beautiful colours. But in terms of body odour, wool is a nightmare. It absorbs sweat and holds on to it. Those bacterial colonies do not just live on your skin, they migrate into the fabric itself. And once bacteria colonize wool, they are incredibly difficult to remove. You would need very hot water and strong detergent. The Romans had neither. They had cold water and urine. Effective at removing visible stains and dirt, sure, but not exactly a bacterial apocalypse. So you end up with this situation where even the wealthiest Romans, even those who bathed every single day and could afford the finest imported perfumes, still had a baseline smell that would probably shock modern noses. Because they were fighting a losing battle against chemistry they did not understand, using tools that actually made the problem worse. And they knew this on some level, they must have. because the sheer amount of perfume they used to, remember those numbers from earlier, 2,800 tons of frankincense and 550 tons of myrrh annually, that is not the consumption pattern of people who smell fresh and clean. That is the consumption pattern of people desperately trying to mask something. But here is where the Romans get creative. Here is where their attempts to solve the body odour problem become both ingenious and utterly absurd. They developed what they called deodorants. Now, when I say that word, you are probably picturing a stick of solid antiperspirant or maybe a spray can. Forget all that. Roman deodorants were different, very different, and some of them were genuinely horrifying. One of the most popular methods was chewing or swallowing concoctions designed to stop your armpits from smelling. Yes, you heard that right. They believed that if you consumed certain substances, it would somehow prevent odour from forming in your armpits. The logic was that body odour was caused by internal imbalances, by excess moisture or heat trapped inside the body, and if you could flush that out, you would stop smelling. One recipe that survives in medical texts describes boiling golden thistle root in fine wine until it creates a concentrated liquid. You were supposed to drink this potion, and it would induce urination. The theory was that by peeing more, you would flush out whatever was causing your armpits to smell. Now, think about this logically for just a moment. Your armpits smell because of bacteria on your skin eating your sweat. How exactly would making yourself urinate more frequently address that problem? It would not. It could not. But the Romans believed it did, and men and women across the empire were drinking thistle and wine concoctions, spending their days running to public latrines, convinced they were solving their body odour issues. Other deodorant recipes called for chewing on herbs, things like mint, parsley and fennel, throughout the day. The idea here was that the pleasant smell of the herbs would somehow emanate from your pores, replacing the unpleasant smell of sweat. And you know what? This one actually makes a tiny bit of sense. Certain compounds from strongly scented foods can be excreted through your sweat. If you eat a lot of garlic, for instance, you will smell like garlic the next day because allicin compounds come out through your skin. So maybe, just maybe, chewing mint all day would give your sweat a slightly minty undertone. But it would not stop you from sweating. It would not kill the bacteria. At best, you would smell like mint-flavoured body odour, which is arguably worse than just regular body odour if you think about it. Like when someone tries to cover up not having showered by spraying themselves with cologne. You end up with this confusing scent profile that is simultaneously floral and funky. There were also topical applications, things you could rub directly on your armpits. Some of these were relatively harmless, mixtures of ash and rose oil, for instance. The ash might have had some mild antibacterial properties, and the rose oil would certainly smell nice temporarily, but others were genuinely dangerous. Lead was a common ingredient in Roman cosmetics and body products. Yes, lead, the toxic heavy metal that causes brain damage and organ failure. The Romans did not know it was poisonous, at least not in the way we understand it today, so they used it liberally. Lead oxide, ground into a fine white powder, was mixed with various oils and applied to the skin to lighten it, to cover blemishes, and yes, supposedly to reduce odour. The writer Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman natural philosopher and wrote extensively about everything from geography to medicine, recorded dozens of remedies for body odour in his work Natural History. Some of them are almost reasonable. Washing with alum, a mineral salt that actually does have antibacterial properties. Others are completely bizarre. Rubbing your armpits with the ashes of a burnt dog's tooth, for example. I am not making that up. Someone, somewhere in the Roman Empire, killed a dog, burned one of its teeth, ground the ashes into a powder, and rubbed it on their armpits, genuinely believing this would make them smell better. Can you imagine being the person who came up with that remedy? What thought process led them there? You know what my armpits need? Burnt dog tooth. And then, and this is the really wild part, the remedy became popular enough that Pliny felt it was worth recording for posterity. Multiple people were doing this. It was a thing. But beneath all these strange remedies and dubious solutions, there is something deeply human happening. These were people dealing with a universal problem, the fact that human bodies smell when they sweat, with the limited tools and knowledge available to them. They were trying. They were experimenting. Some of their experiments were based on reasonable observations, even if the underlying theory was wrong. Others were based on pure superstition. But the impulse behind it all, the desire to not smell bad, to be pleasant to be around, to feel clean and fresh, that is something we share with them across 2,000 years. And here is something else worth considering. The Romans did not have the same standards we do about what level of body odour was acceptable. Their baseline for normal was completely different from ours. We live in an age where many people shower daily, sometimes twice daily, where we have access to clinical strength antiperspirants that literally plug your sweat glands, where we consider any detectable body odour to be a social failure, something embarrassing and shameful. The Romans lived in an era where everyone smelled like their body, at least to some degree. So when you encountered someone at the market or the baths, you were not expecting them to smell like nothing. You were expecting them to smell like a human who'd been walking around in the heat. The question was whether they smelled like an unwashed human or a washed human who had made some effort. The standards were relative, not absolute. This is why perfume was so important. It was not about eliminating body odour entirely. That was basically impossible with their technology. It was about layering pleasant smells on top of neutral to unpleasant ones. It was about signalling effort, signalling wealth, signalling that you cared enough to try. Think about it this way. If everyone around you smells like sweat and wool and olive oil to varying degrees, then the person who smells like sweat and wool and olive oil and also jasmine stands out. They are making an effort. They are showing they have resources. They are participating in the social expectation that people should attempt to smell nice, even if they cannot completely succeed. And for the wealthy, it became an arms race. Not just wearing perfume, but wearing expensive perfume. Not just scenting one part of your body, but scenting every part. Not just using imported fragrances, but using the most exotic, most expensive fragrances available. Because if everyone in your social class is wearing perfume, you need to wear more perfume, better perfume, stranger perfume to stand out. This is how you end up with people putting different scents on different body parts. Mint on the arms, marjoram in the hair, palm oil on the chest, tools of ground ivy on the neck and knees, which, by the way, is a real example from historical sources. Some wealthy Roman women were essentially walking perfume samplers, each part of their body advertising a different exotic scent. And men were doing this too, let me be clear. This was not just a female practice. Roman soldiers perfumed themselves, generals perfumed themselves, emperors perfumed themselves. It was considered part of being civilized, part of being Roman, regardless of gender. Though I will note that there was some social judgment around men who seemed too interested in perfume and cosmetics. There was a fine line between appropriately groomed Roman citizen and effeminate dandy who cares too much about appearance. Where exactly that line fell depended on who you asked, of course. There were debates about this in their literature, arguments about whether a man should smell nice or whether smelling too nice was suspicious. But underneath all the perfume, all the effort, all the exotic fragrances from across the known world, there was still a basic biological reality that could not be escaped. Human beings sweat. Bacteria eat that sweat. Odor results. The Romans could mask it, could layer complexity on top of it, could make it more interesting or more pleasant, but they could not eliminate it, not with the tools they had. So when you walked through Rome on a hot summer day, what you smelled was this incredible cocktail of aromas, layered and complex and sometimes contradictory. The expensive jasmine perfume of a wealthy woman passing by, the sweat-soaked wool of the labourer next to you, the mint someone is chewing to freshen their breath, the rose oil someone rubbed on their skin that morning now mixing with 8 hours of Mediterranean sun and physical exertion, the underlying tang of olive oil that everyone has on them to some degree, because everyone cleans with olive oil. It was not simple, it was not clean in the way we think of clean, but it was distinctly Roman. It was their normal. And in its own way it was fascinating, a sensory landscape shaped by geography, technology, social expectations and human biology all colliding in the streets of the greatest city on earth. But we have focused so far on what the Romans were putting on their bodies, the perfumes and oils and bizarre deodorant concoctions. We have not yet talked about what they were putting in the air around them, about the industries that were filling the city with scents both intentional and accidental. We have touched on the fullers and their urine, yes, but that is just the beginning. Because if you think the urine economy was strange, wait until you hear about the Garam factories. Wait until we talk about what happens when you take thousands of pounds of fish intestines, cover them in salt and leave them to ferment in the Mediterranean sun for months on end. Wait until we explore how something that smelled like death became the most sought-after condiment in the Roman Empire. How valuable that some varieties cost more than fine wine. That is where we are heading next. Into the fermenting vats and fish gut factories, into the economic engine of smell itself. Because Rome was not just wearing scents, Rome was producing them, trading them, building entire industries around them. And some of those industries created aromas that would make your eyes water from 100 yards away. So stay with me. Take a deep breath, maybe through your mouth given where we are going, and prepare yourself for the strange world of Roman industrial odors. Because we are about to meet the people who made their fortunes selling rotted fish guts, and discover why the entire empire could not get enough of it. There is a particular kind of smell that once you have encountered it, you never quite forget. It is the smell of ammonia. Sharp, eye-watering, aggressive. It burns your nostrils and makes your eyes involuntarily water. Modern cleaning products that contain ammonia come with warning labels. We dilute ammonia down to 5 or 10% concentration and still treat it with respect, using it in well-ventilated areas, wearing gloves. Now imagine that smell, but stronger. Much stronger. Imagine it not in a small bathroom, but wafting through entire city blocks. Imagine it as a permanent feature of the urban landscape, as common and unremarkable as the smell of coffee shops is to us today. That was the reality of the Fullonica district in ancient Rome, and the source of that overwhelming ammonia stench? Barrels and barrels of human urine fermenting in the Italian sun. We touched briefly on the fullers in our first section tonight, but I want to take you deeper into this world now, because the urine economy of Rome was not just a quirky historical footnote. It was a massive industry, employing thousands of people, generating significant tax revenue, and creating an entire infrastructure that shaped how the city functioned. And yes, it smelled absolutely horrendous. Let me paint you a picture of how this system actually worked from beginning to end, because the logistics of it are genuinely impressive in their own bizarre way. It starts at street corners throughout the city. At various intersections, particularly in busy commercial districts and near residential areas, there would be large ceramic vessels called dolia. These were substantial jars, maybe 2 or 3 feet tall with wide openings, and they served one purpose: public urination. Now, before you recoil in disgust, remember that public urination was not considered particularly shameful in Roman culture. Public latrines were common, and they were genuinely public. You would sit on a long stone bench with holes cut in it, side by side with other people. No stalls, no privacy, just communal defecation while discussing the weather or politics. So urinating into a jar on a street corner was actually quite modest by comparison. These jars were placed strategically, near taverns, where men who had been drinking would need relief, near the forum, where people spent hours conducting business, along major roads where travellers passed through. The Fullers had essentially created a network of collection points across the entire city. And here is the thing, people were encouraged to use them. There were even small payments sometimes, a tiny fraction of a coin given to people who would regularly contribute. Because for the Fullers, this was not waste. This was raw material. This was the foundation of their entire business model. When a jar filled up, and in a city of close to 1 million people, they filled up quickly, workers would come to collect it. Can you imagine that job? Being the person whose daily task was to go from jar to jar throughout the city, hefting containers of urine onto a cart, trying desperately not to spill any on yourself. The poet Marshall wrote about these workers with a mixture of pity and mockery, describing men who stank so badly that even other poor people avoided standing near them. These urine collectors, and we do not even have a specific Latin word for this profession recorded, which tells you something about how society viewed them, would transport their aromatic cargo back to the fullonica. And it is important to understand that a fullonica was not a small operation. The largest ones were industrial-scale facilities with dozens of workers and multiple vats. The fullonica of Stephanus in Pompeii, which was buried and thus preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 Anno Domini, gives us a remarkably clear picture of what these operations looked like. When archaeologists excavated it in modern times, they found a large open courtyard with multiple enormous stone basins built right into the floor. These basins were about 3 feet deep and 6 feet across, big enough for a grown man to stand in with room to move around. And this is where the real work happened. The Fullers would pour the collected urine into these basins, mix it with water to dilute it slightly, though not too much because you needed that ammonia concentration, and then throw in the dirty clothes. Woolen togas, linen tunics, whatever needed cleaning. The fabric would soak in this mixture for a while, and then comes the part that I find both fascinating and horrifying. The workers would climb into the basins, barefoot. They would literally stand in the urine-soaked fabric and begin what was called the saltus fullonicus, the fuller's jump. They would lift their knees high and stomp down rhythmically over and over for hours, treading the fabric like you might tread grapes for wine, except instead of grape juice, they were splashing in diluted human urine. Why this method? Because it worked. The mechanical action of feet pounding the fabric helped the ammonia penetrate deep into the fibres, breaking up grease and oils, loosening dirt particles, killing certain types of stains. The Romans did not understand the chemistry, they did not know about ammonia molecules or how they interact with lipids, but they knew from generations of experience that this method produced clean white fabric. And white was crucial. Roman social hierarchy was literally colour-coded in many ways. The toga candida, the brilliant white toga worn by men campaigning for political office, had to be absolutely pristine. The word candidate actually comes from this, candidatus, the man in white. If your toga was dingy or yellowish, it broadcast that you were either too poor to afford proper cleaning or too low status to care. The Fullers were not just cleaning clothes, they were maintaining the visible markers of Roman social order. But back to those workers, standing knee-deep in urine all day. The smell must have been absolutely overwhelming. Fresh urine does not smell that bad, honestly. It is mostly water and urea with a mild odour. But stale urine, Urine that has been sitting for days or weeks, fermenting in the heat. That is when the urea breaks down into ammonia, and ammonia is volatile, meaning it evaporates into the air readily. So these Fuloni were constantly releasing ammonia vapor into the atmosphere. The workshops had to be located carefully because of this. You could not put a Fulonica right in the middle of a wealthy residential district, the neighbours would riot. They were typically placed on the outskirts of the city, or in industrial zones near tanneries and dye works, other smelly operations that the upper classes preferred not to think about too much. But in a city as crowded as Rome, there was only so much distance you could create. On the wrong day, with the wrong wind, that ammonia stench could travel for miles. And this brings us to Emperor Vespasian and one of the most famous stories in Roman economic history. Vespasian ruled from 69 to 79 Anno Domini, and he was known for being practical, sometimes crude, but always focused on revenue. The empire needed money. There were legions to pay, aqueducts to maintain, a whole infrastructure to fund. And Vespasian looked at the fullers, at this massive industry built on a resource that literally everyone in the city was producing every single day, and he saw opportunity. He imposed what historians call the vectigal urine, the urine tax. Fullers now had to pay the government for the privilege of collecting urine from public jars. It was, when you think about it, brilliantly cynical. Tax something that is abundant, necessary for an important industry and impossible to avoid. Everyone pees. The fullers need that pee. Therefore the fullers will pay, but the tax was controversial. Vespasian's son Titus, who would later become emperor himself, reportedly complained that this was beneath the dignity of Rome, that taxing urine was too base, too crude, too focused on the disgusting realities of daily life. It made the empire look mercenary and gross, and this is where Vespasian supposedly gave his famous response. According to the historian Suetonius, writing a few decades after the event, Vespasian held up a gold coin, freshly minted with tax revenue. He held it up to Titus's nose and asked, "Does this smell?" Titus admitted it did not. A gold coin smells like metal. It does not smell like the urine that, in a roundabout way, helped pay for it. "Pecunia non olet," Vespasian said. Money does not stink. Those three words became one of the most famous phrases in Latin. They are still used today in business schools and economics courses, usually to make a point about how the source of money is less important than what you do with it, or how profits can sanitize even the most distasteful enterprises. But in its original context, it was literally about urine. The emperor was defending his decision to tax human waste, and you know what? The tax worked. It brought in substantial revenue. The fullers grumbled, but they paid because what choice did they have? They could not do their work without urine. The industry was too important, too embedded in Roman life. Every senator needed his toga cleaned. Every priest needed his white robes maintained. Every merchant wanted to look respectable. The fullers had a monopoly on the technology for achieving that, and urine was their indispensable ingredient. But here is something I find particularly interesting about this whole system. The fullers themselves, the people who owned and operated these businesses, were often quite wealthy. Yes, their work was literally up to their knees in pee. Yes, they smelled terrible. Yes, they were surely looked down upon. But economically, they were doing very well. Many fullers were freedmen, former slaves who had bought or earned their freedom and gone into business for themselves. The Fullonica trade required relatively little startup capital compared to something like shipping or large-scale agriculture. You needed some stone basins, some basic tools, and access to urine, which was free except for the tax. If you worked hard and built a good reputation for producing clean white fabric, you could become prosperous. The Fullonica of Stephanus I mentioned earlier. That was a large, well-appointed facility in a prime location on one of Pompeii's busiest streets, the Via dell'Abbondanza. Stephanus was not some desperate pauper scraping by. He was a successful businessman, operating what was essentially the ancient equivalent of a premium dry cleaning service. And he was not alone. Archaeologists have found at least 11 different Feloniae in Pompeii alone, and Pompeii was a relatively small city compared to Rome. In the capital, there must have been hundreds of these operations, employing thousands of workers, processing tons of fabric every single day. Think about the economic complexity of this for a moment. You have the urine collectors, the lowest tier, doing the dirtiest work for minimal pay. Above them, you have the fullers themselves, the skilled workers who knew how long to soak different fabrics, how much urine to use, when the fabric was clean enough. Then you have the shop owners, managing the business, negotiating with clients, maintaining equipment. Some of the larger operations probably had specialized roles, people who just did the final finishing work, brushing and carding the fabric to raise the nap, or operating the sulfur fumigation process that brightened white fabric even further. It was a whole industry, a smelly, socially stigmatized, absolutely essential industry. And the Romans had mixed feelings about it, which I find deeply relatable. They needed the fullers, they valued clean clothes, but they did not want to think too hard about the process. They definitely did not want to smell it or see it, and they certainly did not want to be fullers themselves, or to marry one, or to live next door to a Fullonica if they could possibly avoid it. There is a wonderful scene in the ancient play The Asinaria by Plautus, where a character is insulted by being told he smells like a fuller. It was shorthand for smelling absolutely terrible, for being so pungent that people could detect you from a distance. Being compared to a fuller was not a compliment. Yet at the same time, fullones had their own guild, their own professional organisation. They had enough political influence to lobby for favourable regulations. They participated in religious festivals. Some of them got quite rich. There is even evidence that some fuller families, after a generation or two of success, managed to transition into more respectable trades, using their wealth to buy land or fund their children's education, essentially laundering their social status the same way they laundered togas. And through it all, in the background of every transaction, every social gathering, every political campaign, there was that smell. The sharp, acrid bite of ammonia hanging in the air, stronger on some days than others depending on the wind, but never entirely absent. The smell of Rome getting its laundry done. I want you to really try to imagine this for a moment, because it is so far removed from our experience. We drop our clothes off at the dry cleaner. If we use dry cleaners at all, many of us just use washing machines at home. And we pick them up a few days later, clean and pressed, and smelling faintly of chemical solvents. The process is invisible to us. It happens behind closed doors. We do not think about it. But in Rome, you could not avoid thinking about it. The smell reminded you constantly. Walking past a Fullonica on your way to the market, you would catch that ammonia tang. Encountering a fuller on the street, you would know immediately what they did for a living just from how they smelled. The industrial process of keeping the city clean was, ironically, one of the city's major sources of foul odours. And yet the Romans accepted this. They had no choice, really. But more than that, they normalised it. Yes, Feloniae smell bad. So do fish markets, so do leather tanneries, so do slaughterhouses. These are the smells of civilization, of industry, of an economy functioning. You endure them because the alternative, wearing dirty clothes, having no access to clean fabric, is worse. What strikes me most about this whole system is how it reveals Roman pragmatism at its finest and most brutal. Here was a city that prided itself on beauty, on philosophy, on law and order, and high culture. The the same culture that produced Virgil and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius. And those same people looked at human urine and thought, we can use that. We can build an industry around that. We can tax that. There was no squeamishness about bodily functions, no pretense that civilized people do not pee or that we should pretend the realities of the human body do not exist. Instead, there was this very practical attitude. Everybody pees. Pee has useful chemical properties. Therefore, we will create infrastructure to collect it and put it to work. But here is the thing. Urine was not even the smelliest industry in Rome. Not by a long shot. If you think the ammonia from Felonii was bad, wait until we turn our attention to what was happening at the Garam factories on the city's outskirts. Wait until we explore what it smells like when you take thousands of pounds of fish intestines, pile them with salt and leave them to rot. I am sorry, to ferment in the sun for 3 months. Because the Romans took that rotting fish slurry and turned it into the most prized condiment in their cuisine, something so valuable that the finest grades cost more per ounce than vintage wine. They put it on everything. They craved it. And the factories that produced it created an olfactory salt that makes the fuller's ammonia seem almost pleasant by comparison. That is our next stop on this aromatic tour of ancient Rome, into the world of fermented fish sauce, where the line between delicacy and decomposition was measured in months of careful malodorous processing, where fortunes were made from what most of us would consider garbage, where the smell was so intense that even the smell-tolerant Romans demanded these factories be built miles outside city limits. So breathe deep while you still can. We are about to enter the Garam district, and I promise you, nothing in modern life quite prepares you for what we are about to encounter. If you have ever walked past a fish market on a hot day, you know that particular smell. That heavy, briny, slightly metallic scent of seafood that has been sitting out perhaps a bit too long. It is not necessarily unpleasant if you are used to it, but it is distinctive, unmistakable. Now multiply that smell by about 1,000. Add in the sweet-sour reek of decomposition, the sharp notes of salt and brine, and let it all bake under the Mediterranean sun for 3 solid months. What you get is something that would make most modern people gag from 50 yards away. And yet the ancient Romans considered this smell, or at least the product that created it, to be so valuable, so essential, so absolutely fundamental to their cuisine that they built an entire empire-wide industry around it. They established factories from Spain to North Africa to produce it. They shipped it in specially marked amphorae across thousands of miles. The wealthy paid astronomical prices for the finest grades, and every single dish in a Roman cookbook, almost without exception, called for at least a splash of it. I am talking, of course, about garum, the fermented fish sauce that was to ancient Rome what ketchup is to America, except even more ubiquitous and infinitely more pungent. Here is what I find absolutely fascinating about garum. The Romans did not just tolerate its smell, they celebrated it. Pliny the Elder, that same natural philosopher who recorded all those body odour remedies we discussed earlier, wrote that the finest garum smelled as pleasant as the most expensive perfumes. He genuinely compared the aroma of premium fish sauce to luxury fragrances. He was not being sarcastic. He meant it. How is that even possible? How does something made from rotting fish guts end up being compared to perfume? To understand that, we need to understand what garum actually was, how it was made, and why the Romans were so completely obsessed with it. Let us start with the basic recipe, which has been preserved in various ancient texts. You take fish, typically small oily fish like anchovies, sardines, mackerel or sprats. But you do not use the flesh, the part we would normally eat. No, for garum you use the parts we throw away. The intestines, the guts, the heads, the blood, the organs, everything that is left over after you fillet a fish for cooking. Some premium versions used whole fish, but the basic product was built on what would otherwise be garbage. You layer these fish parts in a large vat with salt, and not just a little salt, massive amounts of salt. The ratio was roughly 1 part fish to 3 or 4 parts salt by weight. You create layers, salt fish guts, like some kind of horrific Mediterranean lasagna. Then you add aromatic herbs, things like oregano, coriander, fennel, mint, and sometimes even wine or vinegar. These aromatics are important. We will come back to them. Then comes the critical part. You seal the vat and you leave it in the sun for months, 2 months minimum, 3 months ideally, sometimes even longer for premium grades. And during this time, a very specific chemical process is happening. The salt is preventing the fish from rotting in the traditional sense. You know, the kind of rotting that produces that horrible putrid smell of truly spoiled meat. Instead, the salt is creating an environment where enzymes naturally present in the fish guts that start breaking down proteins into their component amino acids. This is fermentation, not putrefaction, and yes, there is a difference. Though I admit the line can seem pretty thin when you are standing downwind of a garam factory. Those amino acids, particularly one called glutamate, create what we now call umami. That savoury, deeply satisfying, almost meaty taste that makes food delicious. It is the same compound that makes Parmesan cheese taste rich, that makes mushrooms taste earthy, that makes tomatoes taste full-bodied. The Romans did not have a word for umami. That term was not coined until the 20th century by a Japanese chemist, but they absolutely craved it. And garam was their primary source. So after 3 months of fermentation, you would open the vat. The smell that would hit you at this moment must have been absolutely incredible, and I mean that in both senses of the word. The workers would strain the liquid through woven baskets, separating it from the solid remnants of fish. The liquid, amber-coloured, thick, aromatic, was garam. The paste that remained was called alec, and it was sold to poorer Romans as a cheaper alternative. Now, here is where things get interesting in terms of smell. High-quality garam, the kind that Pliny compared to perfume, was made with very specific fish species, fermented for longer periods, sometimes with expensive added ingredients like aged wine or exotic spices. The fermentation was carefully controlled, the salt ratio perfectly calibrated. When you smelled premium garam, something like the legendary Garam Sociorum from Spain, which could cost as much as vintage wine, you would not primarily smell rot or death. You would smell the herbs that had been added, the fennel, the oregano, the mint. You would smell the complexity of the fermentation, these deep, rich, savoury notes. You would smell salt and brine and something almost sweet underneath. It was intense, absolutely. But to a trained nose, to someone who grew up with garam, it was appealing. It was the smell of delicious food. Think about how we react to strong cheeses today. Roquefort, Limburger, Epoisse. These are cheeses that objectively smell terrible. Like sweaty feet, like ammonia, like decay. People who are not used to them find the smell genuinely offensive. But to cheese enthusiasts, those same smells signal complexity, depth, quality. The nose adapts. The culture teaches you what to appreciate. That was garam for the Romans. If you grew up eating it every single day, if it was drizzled on your porridge and mixed into your stews and used to flavour your vegetables, then the smell became associated with delicious food, with home cooking, with comfort. It stopped being rotten fish and became dinner. But, and this is a crucial but, not all garam was created equal. Far from it. There was an enormous range of quality, and the cheap stuff really did smell terrible by almost any standard. The garum factories called Sotariae were deliberately built far outside city limits because even the Romans had their limits. These facilities were typically located right on the coast in fishing villages and port towns, places where fresh fish was abundant and where the prevailing winds would carry the smell out to sea rather than inland toward populated areas. Archaeologists have excavated several of these factories and they are fascinating. The one at Baelo Claudia in southern Spain near modern-day Tarifa is particularly well preserved. You can still see the rows of vats carved into the rock, dozens of them, each one large enough to hold hundreds of gallons of fermenting fish. There were pressing facilities, storage rooms for salt, separate areas for different grades of product. It was an industrial operation on a massive scale. And the cell. Oh, the smell. We have to talk about what it must have actually been like to live near one of these places, or even worse, to work in one. Imagine standing in the hot sun next to vats of decomposing fish guts. The air is thick and humid. You can almost taste the salt, the brine. There are flies everywhere, clouds of them, because this is exactly the kind of environment that flies love. The workers who opened the vats after months of fermentation, who strained out the liquid, who cleaned the solid remnants and prepared them for sale as alec, these people must have reeked permanently. We have historical accounts that suggest as much. The Roman writer Seneca, who was generally pretty cranky about luxury and excess, wrote scathingly about garum. He called it that expensive liquid, the corrupted guts of fish. He complained that it burned the stomach with its salted putrefaction. For Seneca, garum represented everything wrong with Roman culture, paying enormous amounts of money for what was fundamentally garbage, convincing yourself that decomposition was delicious. But Seneca was in the minority. Most Romans loved garum. They could not get enough of it. The cookbook attributed to Apicius, which dates from around the 1st century and is one of the only Roman cookbooks to survive, mentions garum in almost every single recipe. Roasted meat with garum, vegetables in garum sauce, fish with garum, fish flavoured with the fermented guts of other fish, which when you think about it is kind of darkly hilarious. Even desserts sometimes had a touch of garum for depth. And the economic scale of garum production was staggering. There were hundreds of Sotariae scattered around the Mediterranean. Spain was the major producer, particularly the southern coast, but there were also factories in North Africa, in Sicily, in the eastern provinces. Amphorae marked with garum labels have been found in archaeological sites from Britain to Egypt. This was a commodity that moved throughout the entire Roman world. Have you ever thought about what it must have been like to be a sailor transporting garum? Your ship's hold filled with hundreds of clay amphorae, each one sealed with wax or resin, but still inevitably leaking tiny amounts of that pungent liquid. The smell would have permeated the wood of the ship itself, soaking into the planks, impossible to remove. There were probably ships that were known specifically as garum haulers, vessels that smelled so strongly of fermented fish sauce that they could not be used for anything else. And when those ships docked at the port in Ostia, Rome's harbour city, and the amphorae were unloaded and loaded onto carts for the final journey into the capital, the smell would have announced their arrival long before they came into view. Imagine being a Roman merchant standing at the docks watching for your shipment and suddenly catching that distinctive aroma on the wind. There is my garum, right on schedule. The price variation was enormous. At the bottom end, you had cheap garum made from whatever fish scraps were available, fermented for the minimum time with no fancy added ingredients. This stuff was sold to common people, to slaves, to anyone who wanted to add some flavour to their bland grain porridge, but could not afford the good stuff. It probably smelled pretty bad, and tasted harsh and overly salty. At the top end you had garum sociorum, the garum of the partners, which was essentially a brand name for premium sauce from specific factories in Spain. This could cost 500 sesterces for less than a pint. To put that in perspective, a Roman soldier's annual salary was around 900 sesterces, so you're looking at more than half a year's salary for a working person, just for a small container of fish sauce. That is more expensive per ounce than almost any luxury good you can name. Why so expensive? Well, like premium wine or aged cheese, it came down to time, expertise, and ingredients. And the best garum was made from specific fish caught at specific times of year. It was fermented for 6 months or more, carefully monitored throughout the process. Expensive aromatics were added, saffron from Persia, which cost more than gold by weight. The final product was strained multiple times, filtered until it was clear and beautiful, a rich amber colour that caught the light. When you opened a container of Garam sociorum, the smell would be complex and layered. Yes, you would smell fish, but also flowers and spices, and something almost wine-like. It was the smell of luxury, of craftsmanship, of something that required patience and skill to create. Rich Romans would display expensive garum at dinner parties the way we might display a rare wine. They would bring out the amphora, show guests the seal, the markings that proved its origin and quality. Then they would open it and pour it into small glass vessels so everyone could appreciate the colour and aroma before it was used to flavour the food. It was theatre, it was status display, it was showing off. And inevitably this led to fraud. Where there is expensive luxury goods, there are counterfeiters. Some unscrupulous merchants would buy cheap garum, add food colouring and a few drops of expensive essential oils to make it smell better, then reseal it in amphorae with fake labels claiming it was premium Spanish Garam sociorum. The Roman government actually had to establish regulations about garum labelling and impose penalties for fraud. There were quality inspectors, standards that had to be met. An entire bureaucracy developed around fermented fish sauce. I want you to think about what all of this meant for the smell of Rome itself. This was not a niche product. This was something in every household, from the poorest insulae to the palatial villas on the Palatine Hill. Every kitchen had garum. People used it multiple times a day. And when you opened a container of it, even the good stuff, it released aroma into the air. So walking through a residential neighbourhood around dinner time, you would smell cooking fires, yes, and baking bread and roasting meat. But cutting through all of that would be the distinctive smell of garum. That briny, fermented, umami-rich aroma wafting from dozens of different kitchens, mixing with the wood smoke and the other cooking smells, creating this complex olfactory tapestry that was uniquely Roman. And if you were anywhere near the commercial districts where garum was sold, where merchants had their shops and stalls, the smell would be even stronger. Amphorae lined up, some of them not perfectly sealed, slowly releasing their scent into the warm air. Customers opening containers to smell the product before purchasing. Merchants decanting from large vessels into smaller ones. All of this contributing to the ambient smell of the city. But here is what really gets me about this whole garum situation. The contrast. The absolute stark contrast between the production and the consumption. In the fishing villages where garum was made, it was industrial, it was working class, it was smelly and kind of gross. The people who made garum were looked down upon the way the fullers were. Their work involved handling dead fish and tolerating terrible smells and hard physical labour in the hot sun. But in Rome, in the capital, garum was refined. It was luxury. It was what sophisticated people used to make their food delicious. The distance, both physical and conceptual, between the soteriae and the dining rooms of the wealthy allowed Romans to enjoy the product without thinking too hard about its origins. It is like how we eat hot dogs without wanting to know exactly what goes into them, or how we enjoy leather goods without thinking about the tannery. The messy, smelly reality of production is hidden away, and we get to experience only the final, polished product. Except that in Rome, you could not hide it quite as effectively. The city was too dense, the supply chains too visible. You could see the Garam amphorae being unloaded at the docks. You could smell the fish sauce shops. The production might be distant, but the product was everywhere. And it smelled like what it was, fermented fish. Still, the Romans made their peace with it. They had to. Garum was too delicious, too useful, too embedded in their cuisine to give up just because it smelled strong. They learned to love that smell, or at least to tolerate it, to associate it with good food and skilled cooking. And that perhaps is the real lesson here. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We can learn to appreciate almost anything if it is culturally valued, if we are exposed to it young, if it connects to positive experiences. The smell of garum, which would probably make most of us today recoil, was for Romans the smell of home, of comfort, of delicious meals shared with family. But as pungent as garum was, as omnipresent as its aroma was in Roman daily life, there were other smells in the city that were even harder to escape. Smells that could not be masked by perfume or made pleasant through cultural conditioning. Smells that reminded every Roman every single day of the one thing that united everyone from emperor to slave: mortality. Because we've talked about the smells of industry and cuisine, of cleaning and fermentation, but we have not yet addressed the smell of death itself, the corpses in the streets, the funeral pyres, the mass graves. The way Rome dealt with the dead, or in many cases failed to deal with them promptly, created an entire layer of odour that permeated certain neighbourhoods, certain seasons, certain times of day. And that is where we are heading next, into the dark reality of mortality in ancient Rome, where social class determined not just how you lived, but how you smelled in death, and how quickly your remains would be removed from the streets where they often ended up. It is a grim topic, I admit, but it is essential to understanding the full olfactory landscape of this ancient city. So take a breath, steady yourself. We are about to explore the smells that even perfume-obsessed Romans could not quite cover up, no matter how much frankincense they burned. Death has a smell. If you have ever experienced it, you know exactly what I mean, and if you have not, well, there is no way to truly prepare you for it. It is sweet and sickly and wrong in a way that triggers something primal in the human brain. It is the smell of organic matter breaking down, of cells rupturing and releasing their contents, of bacteria and enzymes doing the work of returning flesh to simpler compounds. It is a smell that tells you, on an instinctual level, to get away, to protect yourself, because death is happening here and death brings danger. In modern cities, we have systems designed to make sure we almost never encounter this smell. When someone dies, their body is collected within hours, taken to a morgue or funeral home, refrigerated, preserved, prepared, all behind closed doors. The dead move through our cities invisibly, in unmarked vans, processed by professionals we rarely think about. Most people in the developed world can go their entire lives without smelling a decomposing human body. Rome was not like that, not even close. In a city of approximately 1 million people with an average life expectancy of perhaps 25 to 30 years at birth, though if you survived childhood, you might make it to your 50s or beyond, the death rate was constant and high. The historian John Bedell has calculated that roughly 30,000 people died in Rome every year under normal circumstances. 30,000. That is more than 80 people every single day, every day of the year, year after year. And during plague years, the numbers became apocalyptic. The historian Cassius Dio recorded that during the plague outbreak of 189 Anno Domini, 2,000 people were dying in Rome every single day. 2,000. The infrastructure for handling the dead was completely overwhelmed. Bodies piled up faster than they could be processed. The smell must have been absolutely unbearable. But even in normal years, even when there was no plague ravaging the city, death was a visible, smellable presence in Roman daily life in ways that would shock us today. Because here is the thing about Rome: how your body was treated after death depended.
Dear friends, if this story brought you even a little peace tonight, just imagine how many more relaxing bedtime stories are waiting for you on this channel. So, please like this video, share it with someone who also loves calm stories, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know whenever a new story is uploaded. And now, YouTube has introduced something new. It's called Hype. By giving our channel a little hype, you can help us reach so many more people who need rest and relaxation. Your support truly means the world. Finally, let us know in the comments how tonight's story felt for you. Every single word of feedback inspires us to create more magical bedtime journeys. Sweet dreams, and see you again in the next story.